6 stones, 1 gauntlet, 50% of every living thing in the universe, reduced to silence between one breath and the next. In the summer of 1991, those were the numbers Jim Starlin placed on the table when he wrote the Infinity Gauntlet, a 6-issue limited series that remains, more than 30 years on, the most complete image of absolute power that Marvel Comics has ever committed to paper. Thanos of Titan had gathered all 6 Infinity Gems: the green of the Soul Gem, the yellow of the Mind Gem, the blue of the Space Gem, the red of the Power Gem, the orange of the Reality Gem, and the purple of the Time Gem. 6 stones on 6 fingers. One gesture, measured and unhurried. And in the width of that gesture, half of all life in the universe was quietly, permanently subtracted. Not burned, not crushed, not destroyed with any particular drama, but removed the way you remove a number from a sum, and find the sum diminished and barely register the operation itself. Galaxies fell silent. Heroes assembled and were put down. The thunder god crashed from the sky. The sorcerer supreme was unmade and lost. Iron men and hulks and warriors carrying names older than any flag rose up in sequence and were extinguished with the measured patience of a being who had already written the ending and was simply reading it aloud. The Living Tribunal, the nearest thing the Marvel cosmos has to a final word on the subject of anything, was petitioned and declined to intervene. Galactus himself, the devourer of worlds who has consumed more living planets than there are remembered languages, stood at the edge of the battlefield and was not enough. In all of his planning for this moment, and Thanos always planned, in the meticulous and patient way of someone who regards incompleteness as a moral failing, there was one name that sat on a different tier than the others, not higher necessarily, not more threatening in the conventional sense, but different, requiring a different kind of accounting. A name that went into a separate column of its own. Not Thor, not the Silver Surfer, who had arguably the strongest claim to Thanos' particular form of respect. Not Captain America, who had walked toward the Titan without breaking his stride, who had been struck down and risen again, and been struck down again and kept rising, and who had produced in Thanos something that functioned almost like recognition, the acknowledgement of a quality he found meaningful, before it was set aside in the larger mathematics of what he intended to accomplish. The name that required a different kind of planning was Adam Warlock, a being grown in a laboratory in the Florida Everglades, designed as a human template and rejected by his designers before his first day was finished. A being who had died 3 times before he appeared in his 40th Marvel Comics issue. A being described by allies and enemies alike as unstable, erratic, dangerously close to the edge of something that had no comfortable name. A figure whose own contemporaries sometimes paused in the middle of trusting him to wonder quietly whether they should. Every word of it was accurate. Not one word of it was the whole truth. How a being built to be a tool, who kept dying, whose soul was mortgaged to an artifact of alien hunger, who was dismissed before his first day was complete, became the single variable in the cosmos that Thanos could not adequately model. That story begins the way most improbable things begin. In a quiet room, in the sound of something deciding to be born, in a question that nobody standing in the building had prepared an answer for. Somewhere in the warm, wet tangle of the Florida Everglades, 4 men built a god and called it something smaller. The official designation was genetic optimization. The formal name they had given the project was the Progressive Evolutionary Template. The 4 scientists who would eventually be identified in the pages of Marvel Comics as the Enclave, Carlo Zota, Maris Morlach, Jerome Hamilton, and Vladislav Shinsky, had arrived at their shared ambition from different research traditions, and with different theoretical frameworks, but they had converged on a single belief. The next step in human evolution was not a matter of time. It was a matter of will, their will, applied to controlled conditions in a building no satellite had a reason to photograph. Their laboratory was called the Beehive, and the name was not affectionate. It was architectural. The facility had been designed in hexagonal chambers, each one nested inside the next, each a controlled environment with its own temperature and atmosphere, each connecting to the others in a pattern optimized for containment. The Beehive sat in the Everglades like a secret the landscape was holding for someone, insulated by water, by heat, by the constant low sound of insects moving through the surrounding dark in their numberless and indifferent business. Inside, the light never varied. It was blue-white and constant, the light of a room that has no relationship with sunrise or sunset, that belongs to no particular hour, and therefore belongs to all hours equally. In the central chamber, in a room that the other rooms had been arranged to protect, something was growing. The cocoon was gold, not the gold of metal or commerce, not anything cold or coin-adjacent, but warm gold, amber at its edges, pulsing in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the laboratory's ventilation systems and everything to do with something the scientists had not planned for. They had engineered it as a biological incubation chamber. They had controlled every parameter they could name. They had prepared for the emergence of a perfect human specimen, obedient, physically superior in every measurable dimension, genetically sequenced for compliance with the project's vision. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby introduced this moment in Fantastic Four, issue 66, published in September of 1967. The Fantastic Four had been drawn into the investigation of the Beehive through a chain of events the Enclave had tried and failed to contain. In the background of all the explaining and the maneuvering, the cocoon sat in its chamber and did what it was always going to do. It opened, and the being who emerged was not what the Enclave had prepared for, a fact that was evident within the first moments, before he had spoken a word, simply in the quality of the attention he turned on the room. He emerged already more than they had built him to be. Stronger, yes, but the strength was almost beside the point, because the first thing he did was speak, and the first thing he spoke was a question. Not a declaration of purpose, not a request for parameters. A question in a voice that was already calm and already certain of its right to ask, directed at the men who had spent months growing him in that chamber. He looked at them with no hostility and no gratitude, and asked, with the simple directness of a being who had not yet learned the vocabulary of evasion, what it was they wanted. He did not ask in the way of someone prepared to comply. He asked in the way of someone ready to evaluate the answer and make a decision based on that evaluation. The Enclave told him. He listened, he considered it, and then he left, not in anger, not with any statement, simply by moving through the wall of the Beehive as though the wall had been a suggestion he had politely declined, rising into the sky above the Everglades, into the flat white heat of a Florida afternoon, and then upward into the dark where the stars waited at their immense and patient distances. The Enclave would describe this later as a failure, a malfunction in the obedience conditioning, an error in the developmental sequence that had produced a subject too willful, too much his own thing to serve the project's purpose. They were already planning a revised approach before the sound of his departure had finished echoing in the hexagonal chambers. What they did not seriously consider was the possibility that they had succeeded, that the quality they had most wanted to build, the quality of a being beyond ordinary human limitations, was exactly what had emerged and was functioning precisely as designed. and that the limitation they had failed to account for was not in the creation, but in their own understanding of what transcendence meant. A being beyond ordinary human limitations does not accept the limitations of the people who made him. This is not a malfunction. It is the definition of the thing they had attempted to build, arriving precisely as specified. He had no name yet. He was called Him, the shorthand that suffices when nothing more specific is available. In the months that followed his emergence from the beehive, he would encounter Thor in circumstances that were difficult for everyone involved, briefly and disastrously seek Sif as a companion with the uncomplicated directness of a being who had not yet learned that desire and permission occupy different categories, be driven back by the thunder god with considerable force, and withdraw into another cocoon, another period of gestation, another slow breath between one version of himself and the next. The pattern was already visible and already being misread. What looked like a cycle of failure, emergence, confrontation, defeat, withdrawal, return, was something else entirely when examined from inside. Each return brought a being who was more himself than the one who had gone into the cocoon. Not stronger in a simple physical sense, more crystallized, more certain of the qualities that made him distinct and less troubled by the qualities that others had expected him to have instead. The cocoon was not a wound, it was a process. It was his version of the thing every remarkable person does. Between major events, it was thinking. The beehive was eventually emptied. The Enclave moved on. And somewhere in the dark between solar systems, in a golden cocoon drifting on currents that no instrument of the 1960s had been calibrated to detect, the being who was not yet Adam Warlock was quietly becoming the next thing he needed to be. The Everglades went on without any of them. The insects continued their patient business in the warmth. Water found its way into the hexagonal chambers through the places where attention had moved elsewhere, the way water always does. Things grow over what is abandoned in the Everglades. They grow quickly and without consultation, and they do not ask about the plans of the people who left. The man who gave him a name had been doing the same thing the Enclave had been doing, but on a larger scale, and with a specific kind of grief that the Enclave had not yet earned. Herbert Edgar Wyndham, known to the wider cosmos as the High Evolutionary, was a geneticist who had crossed every ethical threshold he had set for himself and then kept going, not from carelessness, but from the particular momentum of someone who has convinced himself that the destination justifies every step taken to reach it. He had elevated animals to human consciousness and beyond, creating races of beings who called themselves his knights, and who grappled, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, with the burden of minds they had been given, rather than grown into over generations. He had looked at the earth that existed and found it, on balance, insufficient. And he had decided, with the particular confidence of a man who has not been seriously challenged in a very long time, to make another one. Counter-Earth was his answer, a duplicate planet, populated with humans, given its own continental geography and its own slow arc of history, placed on the exact opposite side of the sun from the original Earth, so that neither world could ever see the other through any telescope pointed in any direction. It sat there in its patient orbit, invisible and new, and for a brief interval it had been exactly what the High Evolutionary had imagined. A world without the accumulated damage of the original's history, clean, provisional, full of the particular kind of possibility that only the very beginning of something can carry. The man-beast had arrived before the possibility could fully establish itself. The man-beast was a wolf the High Evolutionary had elevated to human intelligence, and then beyond it, driven past the point of coherence into something that operated at the level of pure predatory will, ancient and undeflectable, shaped by nothing except the oldest and most patient of hungers. He had reached Counter-Earth in its earliest days and had spent years doing something more thorough than destruction. He had corrupted it, not obviously, not with visible violence. He had worked in the texture of ordinary decisions, in the arguments that gave the worst impulses of the population better vocabularies, in the institutions that made systemic harm feel like common sense. The world the High Evolutionary had imagined, and the world that had actually developed had, by the time anyone noticed, almost nothing left in common. He needed someone to go there, someone with sufficient capability, and with the quality, rarer than capability and harder to design, of being unable to be fully owned by a situation. He found the golden cocoon drifting in space, recognized the quality of what was inside it, and waited with the patience of someone who had learned, through several expensive lessons, that rushing the emergence of something important is the most reliable way to ruin it. In Marvel Premiere Issue 1, published in April of 1972, Roy Thomas and Gil Kane gave the story its next shape. Gil Kane drew a face that would persist across 5 decades of publication, angular, golden-skinned, with an expression that sits in the particular register of someone who is always slightly ahead of the conversation, not smug, not impatient, but already past the question and into the consideration of what comes after the answer. Roy Thomas gave him a name that announced its own meaning with a directness that was almost aggressive. Adam Warlock, the first man, combined with a word for a being who stands at the margin where the ordinary and the uncanny intersect, who works at the boundary where the usual rules of things begin to fray. The High Evolutionary gave him 2 things in that meeting. The first was a mission: go to Counter-Earth, protect it, be what I could not be for the world I made. The second thing was offered more casually, with less ceremony than the mission, and it would prove to be the more consequential gift by a significant margin. It was a gem, green, small enough to sit against a forehead, warm to the touch in a way that gems are not typically warm. The High Evolutionary had acquired it as part of a larger collection of powerful cosmic artifacts, and had given it relatively little individual thought beyond recognizing it as a substantial power source. He placed it against Adam Warlock's forehead, where it settled as though it had always intended to be there, and he explained the mission without giving the gem more than a sentence of attention. He did not ask what the gem wanted. He did not ask because it did not occur to him that the question was meaningful. This is the kind of oversight that, in retrospect, explains a very great deal about how certain histories develop. Counter-Earth, when Warlock arrived, was Earth filtered through something slightly wrong, the same geography approximately, the same human faces, the same cities in roughly the same locations, the same sky above them at the same angle. But the proportions were off in the way that a reflection seen in still water is off, recognizable in its features and disquieting in a way that takes a moment to locate. The man-beast had done his work carefully and over a long period of time, and the results were not dramatic. A world where ordinary suffering had been given a little more institutional support. A world where the worst arguments had been made marginally more persuasive. A world that looked from most angles and in most light like a reasonable place to live, and that revealed its wrongness only when you asked a certain kind of question and found that the answer came back slightly wrong every time. Adam Warlock moved through Counter-Earth the way he moved through everything, with the quality of someone who cannot be fully owned by a situation, who carries a perspective that doesn't entirely fit the frame the situation provides. He gathered allies in the way that beings like him always gather allies, not by seeking them, but by being the kind of person that other people move toward when they are looking for something they cannot quite name. He encountered the man-beast's influence in its various forms and dimensions. He was present in the world in a way that made the world uncomfortable, because he kept asking it to account for itself. And a world shaped by patient corruption had lost the habit of accounting. This period, documented across the original Warlock series beginning in late 1972, in the work of multiple writers and artists finding their footing with a character who was already too large for any single interpretation, is sometimes treated as prologue in the larger story of who Adam Warlock became. It is easy to move past it quickly, but Counter-Earth established something that everything afterward depended on. It established a being of extraordinary power who chose to be present in the small, grinding, ordinary suffering of a world simply because the world needed someone to make that choice. He was not worshipped there. He was not entirely welcomed. He was found threatening by many of the people he had come to protect, allied with, and then abandoned, celebrated in brief intervals that didn't hold. And then he was betrayed. The crucifixion in Warlock issue 8 is not depicted with the dramatic escalation that comics of that era often favored. It arrives with the quieter weight of an event that has been accumulating for a long time, finding its moment. Warlock was brought down by the accumulated fear and mistrust of the world he had come to protect and killed above it, in view of the sky that the High Evolutionary had made. The cross is not presented as symbol. It is presented as outcome, what happens when a world is afraid enough of what might save it to choose the alternative. He came back. He was already, by this point in his history, a being who did that. But the return was not triumphant, and the being who emerged from the cocoon that formed around him carried something new, something that had not been in any specification, something that the High Evolutionary had not included because it cannot be included by anyone. The knowledge of what it means to be killed by what you tried to protect. The understanding of loss that arrives not from losing something you loved, but from being lost by something you gave yourself to. This is a different grief from ordinary grief. It lives in a different part of a person. It changes the quality of every decision that comes after it. He left Counter-Earth the way he left every world he tried to remain on, not in defeat exactly, but unable to stay, the world unable to hold him in the form he needed to take. He moved back into space, and Counter-Earth receded in the distance behind him, and the High Evolutionary watched him go from whatever distance the High Evolutionary kept. He had been given a world and come back from dying for it. The cost was inside him now. Nothing the Beehive had built had anticipated it, which meant it was, in a precise sense, the first thing about Adam Warlock that was entirely and completely his own. The soul gem was patient in the way that very old hungry things are patient, unhurried, specific, and absolutely certain that the meal would arrive in time. It had existed before the High Evolutionary acquired it, before the Enclave attempted anything, before Adam Warlock was a concept in anyone's working notes, in the broader cosmological continuity that Jim Starlin would eventually establish across multiple runs, in the stories that revealed the Infinity Gems as a set, as pieces of a larger and older architecture that predated any civilization currently using them, The soul gem had been separated from its counterparts long before any of the current story's principal actors were born. It had passed through multiple possessors in that interval. Each one had made the same fundamental error. They had treated it as an object, a powerful object certainly, an artifact with properties, a tool that did something when properly applied. It did do something, but something and everything are not the same accounting. The soul gem ate. Specifically, it consumed the souls of beings who died in Adam Warlock's presence, who fell in the course of battles the gem's power helped him win. Those souls were drawn inward, into a dimension contained within the gem's facets. A pocket reality, the color of amber, warm and still and immense, bathed in light that came from no visible source and moved toward no visible horizon. Inside that space, the souls of the consumed existed in a kind of perpetual afternoon, not imprisoned in any arrangement that involved pain, not destroyed, but held, kept, sustained in the amber quiet of the gem's interior without ever being released from it, without ever arriving at whatever came next. This was understood slowly, in pieces, across several years of publication, as Jim Starlin began pulling back the layers on what the gem actually was. Starlin began his defining work on Adam Warlock with Strange Tales issue 178 in late 1975, and what he found in Warlock's history, and what he built on top of that history, remains among the most cosmologically ambitious work published in the Bronze Age of Marvel Comics. The gem's nature was not a secret he revealed dramatically in a single issue. It was a realization that accumulated across multiple stories, each one adding another dimension to the picture, until the full shape of it was visible. And the full shape of it was this: Adam Warlock, created to represent the next step in human perfection, carried on his forehead a soul-consuming artifact that fed on every victory he won. It was not a tool. It was a bargain. One of those bargains in which the terms are not fully disclosed at the time of signing. A version of the oldest story. Someone was given a gift and told only afterward, gradually, in the accumulation of costs, what the gift had cost. He knew, by the time Starlin arrived in the narrative. Adam Warlock knew what the gem was doing. He had noticed the pattern, the particular warmth the gem generated after deaths in his presence, the quality of its pulse that was slightly more than physical, the dream visions that came in the hours after battle, and showed him something like a landscape that was not a landscape, where voices moved through warm amber air without quite speaking. He knew the gem was eating. He knew what it was eating. He knew the accounting of souls building up inside the amber warmth of its pocket dimension, kept there by the same artifact he wore every day. He kept wearing it anyway, not from laziness, not from the comfortable self-deception of someone who has decided that a cost doesn't count as long as the mission is served, from a specific, clear-eyed calculation that the alternative, removing the gem, losing the capability it provided, facing the threats that were beginning to assemble in the outer dark of the cosmos without it, produced a worse outcome than the ongoing cost of keeping it. He had done the math. He had arrived at a decision. He wore the gem every day as a renewed choosing of that same decision, with full knowledge of what the choosing entailed. This quality, the willingness to carry something terrible while maintaining complete awareness of what it is, would eventually be identified by Thanos as the central element of Adam Warlock's danger. Not the power the gem provided, not the physical capabilities Warlock had developed across his lives and deaths, the awareness, The decision, renewed daily, made from full knowledge rather than from ignorance, or from the easier grace of not having looked too closely. You can plan around power. Power has measurable parameters. It can be matched or exceeded or redirected. You can account for grief, for anger, for the need for revenge. These follow recognizable patterns and produce predictable behavior. You can account for almost any quality that has a fixed and consistent shape. What you cannot adequately plan around is a being who has already done their own planning from inside the worst knowledge about themselves, who has sat alone with the cost and the hunger and the amber weight of what the gem is doing, and who has arrived, on the other side of that sitting, at a decision that does not depend on circumstances to hold. Because a decision made from full knowledge is not the same as a decision made from hope. It does not collapse when things get harder. It does not require the situation to stay manageable. It is already accounted for the unmanageable, and it holds anyway. This was what the Enclave had built and dismissed as malfunction. This was what the High Evolutionary had used without fully grasping. This was what every enemy and every ally of Adam Warlock encountered when they came to him with their calculations. A being who had already finished the same calculation, alone, in the dark, years earlier, and was acting from the place on the other side of it. The amber interior of the soul gem pulsed in its slow and patient rhythm. The souls inside it moved through their warm and unending afternoon, unable to reach whatever came next, but not suffering, kept in the precise way of things that are too valuable to release and too complex to transform. Adam Warlock flew on through the space between stars, carrying his hunger and his knowledge of his hunger, and his choice to keep bearing both. And ahead of him, though he could not yet see it, could not have predicted its specific shape, was the worst version of himself. The next chapter in Adam Warlock's story does not begin with an enemy arriving from outside. It begins with a revelation. In the strange tales run that Starlin would develop into one of the most haunting sequences in the cosmic history of Marvel, Warlock would be shown a figure who had built a church that spanned thousands of worlds and held millions of followers in absolute moral authority. A being of complete conviction and complete cruelty, who was, in the most precise and uncomfortable sense imaginable, the proof of what Adam Warlock was capable of becoming. His name was the Magus, and understanding what Warlock did when he came face to face with the worst version of himself is the key to understanding why Thanos, in his fullest and most capable moment, accounted for one name differently than all the others. Jim Starlin arrived at Adam Warlock's story in the way that certain writers arrive at certain characters, with the recognition that everything that had been built before him was pointing toward a question that nobody had yet asked. The question was this: what does a being who cannot die permanently, who keeps returning from death more knowing than when he entered it, who carries a soul-eating gem and wears it by choice, what does such a being become if nothing stops him? Not if he fails, if he succeeds, if he goes on winning, accumulating power, learning from every death, carrying every cost. What is the destination of that trajectory, if followed to its conclusion without interruption? Starlin answered the question in Strange Tales issues 178 through 181, and the Warlock series that followed, published across 1975 and 1976. The answer was the Magus, a figure of extraordinary physical presence, pink-skinned, enormous in scale, wearing an afro of implausible size that served in the visual grammar of Gil Kane and Starlin's panels as a kind of cosmic crown, who led an institution called the Universal Church of Truth. The church was not a minor operation. It spanned thousands of worlds. Its membership numbered in the billions across multiple star systems. Its doctrine held that suffering was the path to spiritual advancement, and it enforced that doctrine with the particular efficiency of an organization that has confused cruelty with devotion for long enough to have stopped being able to tell the difference. The Magus was Adam Warlock's evil future self. Starlin revealed this across several issues with the measured patience of someone who understood that the most devastating information lands hardest when delivered at the right pace. The being who ran the Universal Church of Truth, who had built an empire of suffering across thousands of worlds, who had systematized cruelty into theology, who was by any available metric one of the most dangerous figures in the cosmic history of the Marvel Universe, was what Adam Warlock was going to become. This was not prophecy in the metaphorical sense. It was timeline mechanics. The Magus was the terminus of Warlock's trajectory, given enough time and no sufficient interruption. The horror of this revelation operates on several levels simultaneously, and Starlin understood all of them. The first is the obvious one. Warlock was going to become a monster. The second is more uncomfortable. The Magus had not abandoned Warlock's original qualities. He had taken them and weaponized them. The willingness to bear terrible costs, the immunity to death, the deep knowledge of the soul gem, all of it was present in the Magus, working in the service of something that had nothing to do with what Warlock intended when he wore the gem and made his calculations. The Magus was not a corruption of Adam Warlock. He was a completion of Adam Warlock, arrived at through a process of accumulation that followed its own terrible logic. The third level of the horror is the one that mattered most to the larger story, and the one that would eventually explain Thanos' particular wariness. Warlock, confronted with the fact of his own future self, had to find a way to prevent that future without destroying himself in the process. He could not simply kill the Magus. The Magus was him, was going to be him, was connected to him through the unbreakable logic of a fixed point in the timeline. He could not simply choose to be different. The Magus had presumably made that choice too, at some point in the years between Warlock's present and the Magus' emergence, and it had not been enough. The situation had no clean solution. Into this impossibility entered, of all figures, Thanos of Titan. Thanos, in this period, the mid-1970s, in the Starlin run that would define him as much as it defined Warlock, was not yet the figure he would become in the Infinity Gauntlet era. He had not yet assembled omnipotence. He had his own ambitions, his own relationship with the concept of death that was already distinctive and would prove central to everything that came after, and his own reasons for finding the Universal Church of Truth problematic. A universal religion devoted to suffering, spanning thousands of worlds, answering to a single supreme authority. This was not compatible with what Thanos had in mind for the cosmos. The Magus was, from Thanos' perspective, a competitor operating in his space. He allied with Adam Warlock, not from sympathy, not from any quality that resembled warmth. From a calculation, perfectly rational, that the Magus was a worse outcome for the cosmos than the alternative, and that Warlock was the most efficient instrument available for addressing the problem. This is important to understand. Their first significant collaboration was transactional on both sides. Warlock needed Thanos' resources and perspective. Thanos needed Warlock's capability and willingness to act at the necessary level. Neither of them was under any illusion about what the other was. The plan they arrived at across the issues of the Warlock run, required Warlock to prevent his own transformation into the Magus, not by changing the future directly, which was impossible within the mechanics of the timeline as Starlin had established them, but by choosing the third option that the situation seemed not to contain. The timeline that produced the Magus required Warlock to survive long enough to become him. It required him to keep going, to keep accumulating, to follow the trajectory to its conclusion. The interruption that would prevent the Magus was not an outside intervention. It was Warlock himself choosing to stop. He used the soul gem to absorb his own soul before the timeline could close the loop that would transform him into the Magus. He died, not in the conventional sense of being killed from outside, but in the more specific sense of choosing the moment of his own departure from the living and acting on that choice before the circumstances that would have made him the Magus could fully establish themselves. He stepped sideways out of the causal chain. The Magus, without the foundation of Warlock's continued survival to build on, was erased from the future. The Universal Church of Truth collapsed. The thousands of worlds it had subjugated found themselves in the particular bewildering silence that follows the sudden disappearance of an absolute authority. Billions of beings who had organized their existence around a theology of suffering found themselves without the institution that had made suffering mandatory. This is not a small thing, and Starlin did not treat it as one. The aftermath of the Magus's erasure from the timeline was complicated and not entirely good, because the end of an abusive system does not automatically produce the knowledge of how to live without it. But the central fact of what had happened remained. Adam Warlock had been shown the worst version of himself, had understood that the worst version was the terminus of his own trajectory, had found the mechanism that would produce it, and had chosen to die rather than follow the path to that destination. He had done this without outside rescue, without a better option handed to him, without a guarantee that anything came after. He had done the accounting himself, and arrived at the answer himself, and acted on it himself. Thanos, watching from whatever distance Thanos maintained, registered this. He registered it in the specific way of someone who spends a great deal of time modeling other beings, and has just observed a data point that doesn't fit any existing model. The beings Thanos understood, the heroes, the cosmic entities, the champions and gods and warriors of every description he had catalogued in his long study of the cosmos, operated from a set of predictable first principles: self-preservation, loyalty to allies, opposition to suffering. These produced comprehensible behavior that could be planned around. What Adam Warlock had just done was not comprehensible within that framework. He had self-sacrificed, yes, but not for anyone else, not for an ally, not for a cause, not in the conventional grammar of heroism where one being gives their life so that others may live. He had sacrificed himself in order to prevent himself from becoming the wrong thing. This is a different category of action entirely, and Thanos, who had built his worldview on a comprehensive taxonomy of the ways beings behave, had no adequate category for it. He filed it under unpredictable and kept watching. The Magus was gone. Warlock was in the soul gem now, absorbed by the very artifact he had worn, and whatever came next was going to require a different kind of planning. There is a version of the Infinity Gauntlet story in which Thanos is simply the villain, and the heroes are simply the heroes. And the drama between them is a drama of power. Who has more of it? Who deploys it more cleverly? Who prevails? This version exists, It is in the pages. It is not wrong. But it is not the whole story. And the part it leaves out is the part that explains why one name sat in a different category on Thanos' list of things to account for. Thanos had been studying Adam Warlock for years before the Infinity Gauntlet assembled itself. The study had begun during the Magus conflict, in the years of their reluctant collaboration, and it had continued afterward in the way of someone who has encountered a data point they cannot fully categorize, and who is too rigorous to let an uncategorized data point rest. He studied Warlock the way a cartographer studies a coastline that keeps moving, with the specific focused attention of someone who understands that incompleteness in a map is a dangerous thing, and who cannot achieve completeness here, and who keeps trying anyway. What he observed during those years was a series of qualities that individually were not remarkable, and collectively produced something he had no adequate precedent for. The willingness to carry the soul gem with full awareness of its nature. The decision to die at a self-chosen moment to prevent the Magus, rather than accepting any outcome that kept him alive longer. The quality of his grief over Counter-Earth, not grief that paralyzed, but grief that informed, that changed the texture of every decision made afterward without disrupting the ability to make decisions. These were not heroic qualities in the conventional sense. They were something else, something more like philosophy in action. In the Strange Tales run and the Warlock issues that followed, the exchanges between Thanos and Warlock carry a tone that is different from any other pairing in Starlin's cosmic catalogue. Not warm. Thanos does not do warm. And Warlock in this period is not a being who has a great deal of warmth to spare, but something like mutual acknowledgement. Two beings who see each other with more clarity than most people see them, and who find that clarity more useful than comfortable. They work together because the math of the situation demands it. They maintain a wariness of each other because the math also demands that. What Thanos understood about Warlock during this period that no other being in the Marvel cosmos had yet understood was this. Adam Warlock was not predictable from his powers. The conventional assessment of a threat model's based on capability. What can this being do? What are the upper limits of that doing? What would be the consequences of those limits being reached? This framework is functional for almost every being Thanos had ever needed to account for. With Warlock, it was insufficient. Because Warlock's most dangerous quality was not located in his powers. It was located in his judgment, in the decisions he was willing to make from inside full knowledge, in the specific shape of what he would do in circumstances that had no precedent. This is the thing that cannot be planned around. You can plan around capability. Capability has a shape. You can plan around motivation. Motivation, even complex motivation, follows recognizable patterns. But the judgment of a being who has died multiple times, who has carried a soul-eating artifact by choice, who has faced his own worst future self and stepped sideways out of the causal chain rather than become it, that judgment operates from a database of experience that no other being shares. And a being whose judgment is unique cannot have their next move predicted by someone whose modeling is built on precedence. In the years between the Magus conflict and the assembling of the Infinity Gauntlet, Warlock existed in a particular kind of in-between state. He had absorbed himself into the soul gem to prevent the Magus. He existed inside the gem's amber dimension, in the warm and quiet and timeless space alongside the other souls the gem had collected over the years. He was not dead in any way that word conventionally means. He was not alive in any way that permits action in the external world. He was held, waiting, in the way that the gem's interior made waiting possible, without anxiety, without the passage of time in any form that produces impatience. Outside the gem, years passed. The cosmos continued its business. Various crises assembled and were addressed by various beings. The larger architecture of what Thanos intended began taking shape in the outer dark. In the places where the planning of someone who thinks on cosmic scales takes place, the calculations that span decades, the preparations that require patience of a kind that most beings never develop because most beings do not live long enough for patience of that kind to be useful. Thanos had spent those years preparing. He had his reasons rooted in a relationship with the concept of death that Starlin had been developing across multiple runs, and that had become, by this point, the defining psychological fact about him. He loved death, not metaphorically, not in the way that warriors who face mortality often develop a relationship with the idea of it. Literally, the entity called death, the personification of mortality in the Marvel cosmic framework, was the object of Thanos' devotion, and the offering he intended to make her with the Infinity Gauntlet was the only one he felt matched the scale of his feeling. Warlock, inside the gem, was becoming something too. Not through effort. There is no particular effort available to a soul held in amber light, but through the nature of the space itself. The soul gem's interior was a dimension of souls, and souls in proximity to each other, even in the patient timelessness of the gem's world, do what souls do when they share a space. They inform each other. Warlock, surrounded by the accumulated experience of every being the gem had ever consumed, was not simply waiting. He was soaking. He was absorbing a quality of awareness that no living being whose consciousness is limited to a single body can develop. When he emerged, and he would emerge not because someone freed him, but because the situation outside would create the conditions for his emergence in a way that the gem's mechanics allowed, he would not be the same being who had entered. He would be more known to himself, more precisely calibrated to the weight of what he was willing to do, and the specific contours of what he would not become. He would carry inside him not just his own deaths and returns, but the residue of every death the gem had ever witnessed. This is not a power in the conventional sense. It is a form of wisdom that has no other access point. Thanos had spent those years preparing the gauntlet. Adam Warlock had spent those years inside an amber gem, becoming the being who was going to be the one variable in Thanos' perfect plan that Thanos could not adequately account for. Neither of them knew this yet, or rather, Thanos suspected it and could not find the shape of the suspicion precisely enough to plan around it, which is the most dangerous kind of suspicion, the kind that keeps you up when you sleep at all, in the hours before dawn. The manner in which Adam Warlock first entered the Soul Gem is worth examining carefully, because it establishes a pattern that repeats across his entire history, and that eventually became the cornerstone of the quality Thanos found most difficult to categorize. In the original Warlock series, in the Starlin issues that followed the Magus conflict, and that led to the end of that first defining run, Thanos had shifted to his own agenda, with the focus of someone who had been patient about it for long enough. He had already moved beyond the Magus situation and toward something larger. The assembly of the cosmic cube, an object of reality-reshaping power that Thanos intended to use in the service of his devotion to death. The assembled heroes of Earth and several cosmic allies had gathered to oppose him. Warlock among them. His role in this conflict was not the role of the strongest fighter. The heroes present included beings of greater raw physical power than Warlock possessed at that moment, His role was closer to the role of the strategist, the one who understood the shape of the situation beyond what the battle itself revealed. He had been in proximity to Thanos across the years of the Magus conflict. He had studied that proximity with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, complete, clear-eyed, and without the distorting lens of either admiration or hatred. In the critical moment of the Cosmic Cube confrontation, documented across the issues of Marvel 2-in-1 Annual, Issue 2 and Avengers Annual, Issue 7, published in 1977, Thanos turned the cube's power on Warlock with a directness that was not, in context, surprising. What was surprising was the result. Warlock was not destroyed. He was not simply killed in the conventional sense of that word. He was absorbed into his own soul gem, drawn into the amber interior by the mechanics of the gem's nature, and the particular way in which the cube's power interacted with it. The amber warmth, the timeless light, the community of souls moving through their perpetual afternoon, unable to leave, unable to progress, but also unable to suffer in the ways that living beings suffer. Warlock was there now. Not as a conqueror of the space, he was a soul held by the gem the same as all of the others, subject to the same rules, existing in the same unchanging light. He had carried the gem on his forehead for years, had known its nature, had made his accounting of it, and kept wearing it anyway. And now he was inside the thing he had known and chosen. This is worth pausing over, in the way that sleep stories pause over things worth pausing over. He had known this was possible. Not this specific outcome, perhaps, with this specific mechanism. The Cosmic Cube's interaction with the Soul Gem was not something he had specifically anticipated, but the general possibility of the gem consuming him as it had consumed others were, of ending up inside it rather than wearing it. He had known this was within the range of outcomes available. He had continued wearing it anyway, as a renewed choice made from full knowledge. The fact that he ended up inside the gem was, in a strange and precise sense, the fulfillment of the accounting he had already done. He had decided that the costs of the gem were acceptable. The ultimate cost, being absorbed, was the end point of that accounting. He had accepted it in advance, in the abstract, in the patient way of someone who has followed an argument to its conclusion, and accepted the conclusion even when the conclusion is difficult. When the conclusion arrived in its concrete form, it was not a betrayal. It was the account settling. Inside the gem, in the amber world that had no sunset or sunrise, that maintained its eternal middle light without variation, Adam Warlock existed alongside the souls the gem had consumed across its long history. He was not alone there. He was in the largest possible company, the accumulated soul community of every being the gem had ever touched. And while the word community implies interaction and communication of a kind that is difficult to specify for beings in this state, it is not wrong to say that something was happening in the gem's interior during the years Warlock spent there. Something that had the texture of very slow learning, very patient accumulation. The kind of becoming that is only available when all the usual urgencies of living have been temporarily removed. Outside the gem, Thanos was defeated, not by anyone in the assembled resistance, but by a combination of factors that included his own psychology. He was restored to stone by Moondragon, and then by the cosmic entity called Eternity, and the cosmic cube was shattered, and the immediate crisis resolved in the way of crises that are too large for any single being to hold, by circumstances conspiring, by luck and sacrifice, and the specific quality of a situation that has exceeded even the most careful planning. The heroes moved on. The cosmos continued. Adam Warlock remained in the gem. Months passed, then years in publication time. The gem changed hands. The larger narrative of the Marvel Universe moved through the events of the early 1980s, events large and small, crises and resolutions, the ordinary, extraordinary business of a fictional cosmos that never stops generating new complications. And somewhere in the amber light, in the timeless quiet of the Soul Gem's interior, a being who had died by his own choice, been absorbed by his own artifact, and was existing in the company of every soul the gem had ever kept. That being was, in the only way available to him, waiting. He waited the way the gem itself waited, without hurry, without anxiety, with the particular quality of patience that belongs to something that is not subject to the ordinary pressure of time. And when the cosmos outside the gem generated the conditions that would require his return, when the situation became large enough, specific enough, shaped precisely enough to need the particular quality of judgment he carried, the gem would release him. Not because anyone asked, because the mechanics of the situation would make it necessary. And Adam Warlock, who had spent years learning what it is to be both the container and the contained, would return carrying everything he had accumulated in the amber quiet of that perpetual afternoon. He did not emerge from the Soul Gem because someone rescued him. This is the first and most important fact about his return. And it is a fact that the larger story of who Adam Warlock is depends on getting right. In the Marvel publishing timeline, years had passed between Warlock's absorption into the gem and his emergence from it. In the in-universe timeline, the interval was comparable. The gem had been through several hands, had been claimed and reclaimed, and moved through the cosmic landscape as artifacts of power tend to be moved, with urgency, by beings who understood its capability without fully understanding its occupant. When Adam Warlock emerged from the Soul Gem in the stories leading into the Infinity Gauntlet era, it was because the exterior situation had developed to a point where the mechanics of the gem, the specific nature of its relationship with the being inside it, created the conditions for release. He came out into a cosmos that had been continuing its business without him, that had generated new complications and new alignments, that had moved in the ways of things that don't stop moving simply because a significant figure has temporarily withdrawn from participation in them. The universe does not wait. It particularly does not wait for the beings who are most capable of addressing its problems, which is one of its more consistent qualities. He came out changed. This is also important and worth stating precisely. The Adam Warlock who emerged from the Soul Gem after those years in its amber interior was not simply the Adam Warlock who had gone in, slightly older and somewhat rested. He was more precisely himself. The time in the gem, in the company of every soul it had ever consumed. In the timeless light that had no urgency to it, without the usual pressures of living that prevent the kind of extended self-examination that actually changes a person, had produced something that years of external experience rarely produce. He knew, with a clarity that was almost architectural, exactly what he was and what he was not, what he would do and what he would not become. This knowledge was not comfort. It was not particularly pleasant in any conventional sense, but it was complete in a way that almost nothing available to the living is complete. The living are always in motion, always generating new experience faster than they can fully process it, always slightly behind on the work of understanding who they are, because the person they are keeps generating new evidence that needs to be accounted for. Warlock, in the amber interior of the gem, had had the unusual luxury of stillness. He had processed everything. He had arrived on the other side of that processing at a self that he knew entirely. He emerged into a specific situation. Thanos was assembling the Infinity Gauntlet. The scale of what was being assembled, 6 gems, all 6, the completed set of the most powerful artifacts in the Marvel cosmos, registered on the instruments of every significant cosmic entity and organization simultaneously. The Silver Surfer was already involved. Pip the Troll had made contact with Warlock's known allies. Gamora, who had her own complicated history with Thanos and her own relationship with Adam Warlock, that the larger story of Marvel's cosmic era would continue to develop across several decades of publication was in the field. Warlock assessed the situation with the specific clarity of someone who has had a long time to think without distraction, and who has just returned to a world that has been moving quickly toward a destination he can read without much difficulty. He understood, in the way that beings who have spent years in the Soul Gem's amber interior understand things, what Thanos intended to do. He understood it more completely than any other figure in the Resistance was capable of understanding it, because his understanding was not limited to the tactical question of what the completed gauntlet could do. It extended to the psychological question of what Thanos would do with it, and more specifically, what Thanos would do with it when he had won. This distinction between what a being can do and what they will do, between the limit of their power and the shape of their psychology, is the distinction that the rest of the Resistance missed, and that Warlock had been developing slowly across years of proximity to Thanos and years of solitude in the Gem. The heroes who assembled against Thanos understood that he was going to use the gauntlet to kill half of all life. They understood this was wrong, and that it needed to be opposed, and they assembled to oppose it with everything they had. They were right about all of this. But Warlock understood something else as well. He understood that the question of what happened after Thanos won, after the half of all life was erased, after the heroes had fallen, after the cosmic entities themselves had been put down, was not a question anyone else was asking, because no one else had seriously modeled the possibility that Thanos would win all the way to the end. Warlock had modeled it, and the model he had built from his specific knowledge of Thanos' psychology suggested that the outcome after Thanos' complete victory was not the stable universe Thanos imagined he was creating. Thanos would destroy himself, not deliberately, not even consciously, but in the way of someone whose entire life's architecture has been built around reaching a destination, and who has not seriously reckoned with what comes after arrival. The Infinity Gauntlet was Thanos' offering to Death. Death's response to that offering. Starlin had established, across multiple runs, that Thanos' devotion was not requited in the way he imagined, would leave Thanos exactly as it always left him, yearning towards something he could not fully reach, holding everything in the universe except the thing he had assembled everything in the universe to obtain. A being in that position makes mistakes, large mistakes, mistakes of the kind that create openings. Warlock, who knew this about Thanos with the precision of someone who had been studying him across years of collaboration and opposition, and amber-lit contemplation, was not planning to defeat Thanos at the peak of his power. He was planning to be present when Thanos made the mistake that his own psychology made inevitable. This is not heroism in the conventional sense. It is something colder and more patient and ultimately more effective. He gathered the people he needed. He made the preparations that could be made. And he watched the gauntlet assemble itself, from the distance he maintained, with the specific quality of waiting that belongs to someone who already knows the shape of what is coming and is conserving themselves for the moment that matters. Before the battle, there was a question about the gems themselves. The 6 infinity gems, the soul, the mind, the space, the power, the reality and the time, were, individually, among the most dangerous objects in the Marvel Universe. Together, as the Gauntlet had demonstrated, they constituted something for which the word dangerous was inadequate in the same way that the word large is inadequate to describe the distance between galaxies. The assembled Gauntlet was omnipotence in portable form. And the question, in the aftermath of the Gauntlet crisis, and in the period leading up to it, was what should be done about them. Warlock's answer was the Infinity Watch, a team whose membership was determined not by the conventional criteria of heroic worthiness or combat effectiveness, but by a specific logic that was practical and strange in equal measure. Each member of the Watch would hold 1 gem, not because they were the best qualified, in the conventional sense, to hold it, though that was part of the calculus, but because distributing the gems across multiple beings, each with their own personality and history and relationship to the specific gem they carried, was the most effective available safeguard against any single being assembling the complete set. The members of the Infinity Watch in its initial formation were Warlock himself, Pip the Troll, Gamora, Drax the Destroyer, and Moondragon. The choice of these specific individuals, particularly Pip and Drax, who were not, by the conventional metrics of cosmic responsibility, obvious candidates for stewardship of reality-altering artifacts, was itself a demonstration of Warlock's specific kind of reasoning. He was not looking for the most trustworthy holders. He was looking for the most effective distribution. A gem held by someone who would be immediately recognized as a target was less safe than a gem held by someone who would not be recognized as a target at all. Warlock himself kept the Soul Gem. Of all the choices available to him in this arrangement, this was the most revealing. He could have kept the Reality Gem, which was arguably the most powerful for general purposes. He could have kept the Time Gem, which would have given him capabilities that his specific kind of long-game planning could have deployed most effectively. He kept the Soul Gem, the artifact he had worn the longest, at the greatest personal cost, whose hunger he had been feeding by continued use for years, whose amber interior he had inhabited. He kept the one with which he had the most complicated and costly relationship. This choice is not explained in the comic pages in direct terms. It is shown rather than stated. But what it shows to anyone reading carefully is that Adam Warlock did not keep the Soul Gem because it was the easiest choice or the most comfortable one. He kept it because the cost he had already paid for it established a relationship with it that no one else could replicate. He had earned his particular knowledge of the gem through a price that was specifically his. Passing it to someone else would not transfer that knowledge. It would simply give someone else a powerful artifact they understood less well than he did. And the understanding, in this case, was the point. The Infinity Watch operated as a team in the specific way that a team of people with fundamentally incompatible personalities and histories operates, with friction, with misunderstanding, with the ongoing low-level negotiation of coexistence that consumes enormous energy while simultaneously producing something that none of the members could produce alone. They were not a harmonious group. They were not particularly comfortable with each other. They functioned, which was what the situation required. In the background of the Watch's formation and operation, the intelligence picture about Thanos' intentions was becoming clearer. The nature of the Gauntlet had been established. the scale of what he intended had been in broad terms understood. The question was no longer whether it would happen. The evidence was sufficient to conclude that it would. But when, and what the shape of the opposition should be when it did. Warlock worked through this question with the specific quality of attention he had developed across multiple deaths and resurrections and years in amber light. Patient, comprehensive, and oriented. Not toward the question of how to win the conventional battle, but toward the question of what winning actually meant in a situation where the opponent held omnipotence. He understood, and none of the others fully understood, that the gauntlet could not be defeated in the field by superior force. The numbers were unambiguous on this point. Thanos, with the assembled Infinity Gems, was not a being who could be overcome by assembling a larger or more powerful coalition of opponents. He had to be overcome by something else. By the specific quality of his own psychology, meeting the specific conditions that Warlock was positioning himself to create. This is strategic thinking of a kind that most beings, even very intelligent, very capable beings, cannot do, because it requires not just modeling the opponent, but modeling them accurately enough to predict what they will do in circumstances that have never previously existed. Thanos had never previously held omnipotence. No reliable data existed about how he would behave when he did. But Warlock had been studying Thanos for years, across collaborations and conflicts, and he had a model. He trusted the model. The watch prepared as well as they could for what was coming. It was, in retrospect, preparation that would matter less than the quality of the judgment Warlock carried into the battle. Judgment built across years of cost and loss, and amber-lit contemplation. He had learned, as few beings in the cosmos had learned, what it meant to hold something terrible for the right reasons. He had learned what it cost. He had kept paying it anyway. And now the cost was almost fully paid, and the reason was almost fully here. And everything that had come before, the beehive, the counter-earth, the gem, the Magus, the amber years, had been preparing him for a moment that from the outside looked like a battle. It was not a battle. It was an argument. And Warlock had been making it, without anyone's knowledge, for his entire life. In the Infinity Gauntlet Issue 1, published in July of 1991, Thanos completed the assembly of the 6 gems and performed the gesture that removed half of all life from the universe. This is the event, the fact, the thing that all of the preparation on every side had been moving toward. What is less often examined, and what matters more to the story of Adam Warlock, is not the gesture itself, but what Thanos intended to follow it. The erasure of half of all life was not in Thanos' conception the event. It was the offering. It was the gift he intended to lay at the feet of death, the embodied personification of mortality in the Marvel cosmic hierarchy, as a demonstration of the scale of his devotion and the completeness of his capability. He had done this at a smaller scale before, with the cosmic cube. He was doing it at the largest possible scale now, because the scale was the point. He wanted Death to see what he was willing to do for her. He wanted her to be impressed in a way that nothing smaller could impress her. Warlock understood this. He understood it in a way that the Silver Surfer did not, that the assembled heroes did not, that even the cosmic entities who would eventually be drawn into the conflict did not fully grasp. They understood that Thanos was dangerous. They understood that the gauntlet was dangerous. They understood that the erasure of half of all life was a catastrophe requiring immediate response. All of this was correct. But their response, built on this understanding, was necessarily incomplete, because it was addressed to the problem of what Thanos could do and did not adequately account for the problem of what Thanos wanted. What Thanos wanted, and this is the key, was not the gauntlet's power as an end in itself. The power was instrumental. The gauntlet was the instrument of his offering, and his offering was made to someone who, by the logic of what Thanos and Death were to each other, would never fully receive it in the way he imagined. This is not a tactical vulnerability in the conventional sense. It is a psychological one, and psychological vulnerabilities are more difficult to exploit because they require a different kind of knowledge to identify and a different kind of patience to wait for. Warlock organized the resistance. He gave instructions. Those instructions from the outside looked like a conventional battle plan. Assemble here, approach at this angle, use this capability at this moment. But the instructions were not designed to win a battle. They were designed to create a sequence of events that would position Warlock in the right place at the right moment. When Thanos, having won the battle and the offering and the arrival of the moment he had been planning toward, discovered that the moment was not what he had imagined it would be. The heroes assembled in the pages of the Infinity Gauntlet, Issue 4 and 5 are among the most impressive collections of power that Marvel Comics had assembled in a single narrative to that point. Thor, Iron Man, Captain America, the Hulk, the Torch, the assembled warriors and champions and cosmic-level figures drawn from every corner of the Marvel Universe, gathered in the most explicit demonstration available that everything the universe had to offer was being directed against this single adversary. Thanos received them. He had expected them. He had built his strategy around the assumption of exactly this kind of opposition, and he had accounted for it carefully. They fell, one by one, in the order that a being holding omnipotence dictates, with the patience of someone who is not in a hurry because there is no way to be in a hurry when you hold omnipotence. Thor swung the hammer, and the hammer did what a hammer does against a being who controls reality. Captain America rose from every knockdown and kept walking forward. And the walking forward was the most impressive thing in the battle, and it accomplished nothing against the arithmetic of absolute power. The assembled forces of the Marvel Universe performed, with the courage and commitment and tactical intelligence available to them, the function of demonstrating that the assembled forces of the Marvel Universe were insufficient. Warlock watched. It's the important detail. He was present, but he was not in the primary assault. He was positioned, not behind the line of battle, not in retreat, but sideways from the main engagement, in the specific place that his model of the situation suggested he needed to be. He was watching Thanos. Specifically, he was watching the quality of Thanos' attention during the battle. And in the quality of that attention, he was looking for the thing his model predicted. The first sign of the turn inward, that would follow the recognition that the offering had been made, and the offering had not produced the response Thanos was expecting. The cosmic entities arrived after the assembled heroes had fallen. Galactus, the Celestials, eternity itself, the cosmic embodiment of the universe's existence. They engaged Thanos in the pages of Infinity Gauntlet, Issue 5, with the full weight of what they represented, which is to say with the full weight of the universe's oldest and most fundamental powers, directed against a single target. Thanos received them with the same patience he had received the heroes. He was omnipotent. The cosmic entities were not. But in the moment of that victory, the moment when even eternity had been defeated, when the most ancient powers available had been put down, and Thanos stood at the literal peak of everything, something happened that Warlock had been waiting for. Thanos stepped out of his physical body. He ascended to a higher state, seeking to become part of the universe itself, and in doing so, he left his physical form behind. This was not a tactical error in any sense that battle planning could have anticipated. It was a psychological one. It was the first visible manifestation of the thing his model of Thanos had predicted, the moment when the offering was made and found incomplete, and the response was not satisfaction but expansion, the restless reaching of someone who has gotten everything he asked for and discovered it was not the thing he actually needed. In that moment, Nebula, a figure peripheral to the main battle, a being Thanos had reduced to a barely living horror as a demonstration of his capacity for cruelty, reached up and took the gauntlet from the hand Thanos had vacated. She put it on. She used it to restore herself. The sequence of events that followed was exactly the chaos that omnipotence in untrained hands produces. Reality twisting in the directions that immediate desire directs it without wisdom or restraint, producing an outcome that pleased no one and threatened everything. But it created an opening. And Adam Warlock, who had been waiting for an opening in the shape that his model of the situation said an opening would eventually take, moved into it the moment in Infinity Gauntlet Issue 6, when Adam Warlock touched the soul gem to the Infinity Gauntlet and drew the assembled power of the 6 stones into himself, is the moment the story had been building toward from his first emergence from the cocoon in the Florida Everglades. It does not look that way from outside. From outside, in the frame of a battle, it looks like a tactical move, a being seizing an opportunity created by Nebula's intervention, reaching for the most powerful available object in the chaos of a situation that has briefly become fluid. But from inside Warlock's understanding of the situation, it was not a tactical move. It was the execution of a plan he had been constructing since before the battle began, since before the gems were assembled, since the moment he had emerged from the Soul Gem's amber interior, carrying the specific knowledge of Thanos' psychology that allowed him to build a model that no one else could build. He touched the gauntlet. The 6 gems responded to the Soul Gem, the way that related objects respond to each other across the Marvel cosmic framework, with a kind of recognition. The power transferred, and Adam Warlock, who had worn the Soul Gem for years and lived inside it for years more, who had made every possible accounting of the cost of carrying a terrible power and kept paying it anyway, held the Infinity Gauntlet. The sensation is described in the pages with the specific understatement that Starlin deployed throughout the run. Warlock does not become loud or dramatic in the moment of omnipotence. He becomes, if anything, quieter, more still. The quality of his attention, which had always been complete, focused itself on the situation with a precision that the assembled characters who witnessed it described later as something that looked less like power being used and more like understanding being applied. He used the gauntlet first to restore what had been destroyed. He brought back the half of all life that Thanos had erased. The restoration is depicted in the pages as an expansion of light, not a dramatic event, not a visible reversal, but a quiet return, the way a room fills with light when you open a curtain. Beings who had been absent were simply present again. Damage that had been done was simply undone. The specific mechanism of the restoration was not explained in technical terms, because the specific mechanism was not the point. The point was that Adam Warlock, who had been built as a weapon, who had been dismissed as a failed experiment, who had died multiple times and been absorbed by his own artifact, and carried a soul-eating gem on his forehead for years, that being, in the moment of his greatest power, used the power to restore. Thanos, returned to his physical form, watched this happen. The accounts of his behavior in this moment, across Infinity Gauntlet, Issue 6, and in the supplementary material that Starlin developed in subsequent stories, describe something that is not quite the response of a defeated villain. He had expected, if he lost, to lose in the manner of someone who had been overpowered. He had not anticipated losing in the manner of someone whose own psychology had created the opening for the loss. He had not anticipated that the being who would prove decisive was one he had, in all his years of careful preparation, categorized as the most unpredictable variable, and then been unable to fully account for. There is a moment in the aftermath, documented in subsequent Starlin material, in the retrospective analysis of the Gauntlet crisis that appears across multiple issues, where Thanos, speaking to Warlock with the directness that had always characterized their exchanges, acknowledged what had happened with a specificity that most villains who have been defeated never achieve. He had lost not because he had been outfought, not because the assembled heroes had proven stronger, not even because the cosmic entities had overpowered him. He had lost because there was a variable in his planning that he had identified as unpredictable and had been unable to make predictable, and that variable had been Adam Warlock. And Adam Warlock had done precisely what an unpredictable variable does when planning meets the actual situation. Something that no amount of planning had fully accounted for. This is fear, in the vocabulary of a being like Thanos, not the visceral fear of a body in danger. The colder and more considered fear of someone who has built his entire existence on the bedrock of comprehensive preparation, and who has encountered, for what may be the first time, something he could not prepare for. Something that operated from a different logic than anything his taxonomy had contained. Not stronger, not faster, not more powerful in any dimension he measured, but genuinely, in the specific technical sense, unpredictable. The assembled heroes, the resistance, the cosmic entities that had been put down and restored, they all witnessed Warlock holding the gauntlet. They had watched him do it. They had seen him use it to restore what had been destroyed. They stood in the aftermath of the battle and the restoration, and looked at the being holding the most powerful object in the universe, a being they had known as unstable, unreliable, too close to the edge of something dangerous to fully trust. And they felt, in the complicated way of people who have just been saved by the thing they were afraid of, the particular mixture of gratitude and unease that the situation produced. Warlock stood with the gauntlet and felt the weight of it. Not the weight of power. He was familiar with that weight, had carried the Soul Gem's version of it for years. The weight of the decision, what he was going to do with this. Not in the tactical sense. The tactical questions had been answered. In the philosophical sense, the question of what a being built as a weapon, who had spent his entire existence refusing to be a weapon, does with the most powerful weapon in existence. The question of whether the answer to that question was available in his accounting, or whether this was the first thing he had encountered that was genuinely beyond the ledger he had built. He held the gauntlet. He thought. Outside, the universe waited, restored, present, carrying the specific quality of something that had been briefly absent and has returned, and is not yet certain the return will hold. The light was real. The half of all life, returned between one breath and the next, was breathing. And Adam Warlock stood in the center of the largest consequence of his existence, and chose, as he had always chosen, not to be the weapon he had been built to be. But the choosing had a cost he had not yet encountered. The cost arrived in the form of a judgment, and the judgment came from the highest authority available in the Marvel cosmic framework, which meant it could not be appealed, could not be negotiated, could only be accepted or refused. Warlock accepted it. This acceptance was, in its own specific way, more remarkable than anything he had done with the Gauntlet. The Living Tribunal is, in the Marvel cosmic framework, the judicial expression of the multiverse itself, a three-faced entity whose three faces represent equity, necessity, and revenge in perpetual balance, and whose rulings are not subject to appeal because there is no higher court to appeal to. It appeared to Adam Warlock in the aftermath of the Gauntlet crisis with the quality of something that has been waiting for the right moment, rather than something that has been summoned. The judgment it rendered was specific and delivered without preamble. Adam Warlock was unworthy to wield the Infinity Gauntlet. The gems would be distributed. The power would be dispersed. He would return to being what he had been before the battle, a cosmic-level being of significant capability who did not hold omnipotence. And the question of what to do with the Infinity Gems would be addressed by a different arrangement. The grounds for the judgment were not the grounds that would have occurred to most observers of the situation. Warlock had used the Gauntlet well. He had restored the half of all life that Thanos had erased. He had not misused the power, had not been seduced by it, had not done the thing that the worst-case modeling of a being holds omnipotence would produce. By any functional assessment of what he had done while holding the Gauntlet, he had been worthy in precisely the way that the crisis had required. The Tribunal's objection was not to what he had done, it was to what he was. Specifically, in the process of his long history, in the Magus conflict, in the consequences that had followed from his defeat of his own evil future self, something had happened to Adam Warlock's essential nature that the Tribunal regarded as a disqualifying condition. His evil aspect had been expelled from him in the form of the Magus. His good aspect, too pure in its goodness to coexist with the ambiguities of ordinary existence, had been separated from him in a way that had not yet fully manifested, but that the Tribunal could read in the structure of what he was. He was neither good nor evil in the ordinary sense. He was something more ambiguous, something that occupied the space between those categories without resolving into either. This is what the Tribunal found disqualifying. Not malice, not incompetence, not proven untrustworthiness, the ambiguity itself, the fact that his soul had been fractured by the very experiences that had made him capable of handling the Gauntlet responsibly, and that the fragments of his soul were going to cause problems in the future, because that is what fractured souls do. He accepted the judgment. He did not argue. He did not make the case for himself that the available arguments, and there were good arguments available, would have supported. He received the judgment of the highest authority in the Marvel cosmos, a judgment that took the most significant moment of his existence, and ruled it insufficient. And he accepted it with the same quality of clear-eyed acknowledgement he had brought to every other cost he had ever paid. This acceptance is, in retrospect, among the most revealing things Adam Warlock ever did. a being who had fought his way back from multiple deaths, who had outwitted his own evil future self, who had positioned himself correctly through a battle against omnipotence and won. A being of this description, accepting a ruling that stripped him of the greatest power he had ever held, with the specific quality of someone who had already done the accounting and found it legitimate, is displaying something that goes beyond humility in the conventional sense. It is the demonstration of a particular relationship with power, one in which power is a means and never an end, and therefore its removal does not threaten the foundation of who you are. Thanos, from whatever vantage point he occupied in the aftermath of all this, defeated, present, watching, registered the acceptance. He had expected, if the tribunal ruled against Warlock, to see resistance. Not necessarily open defiance, but the particular friction that beings of significant power generate when power is taken from them. What he saw instead was someone receiving a judgment they found fair, not because the judgment was pleasant, but because the being receiving it had already internalized the standard the judgment was applying. Warlock had known, in some part of himself, that he was not equipped to hold the gauntlet permanently. He had not sought to hold it. He had used it because the situation required it, and then released it because the situation no longer required it. The tribunal's ruling was confirmation of a conclusion he had already reached. The Infinity Gems were distributed according to the new arrangement. Warlock kept the Soul Gem, the one he had the most complicated relationship with, the one whose cost he had been paying the longest. The others went to the members of the Infinity Watch. The most powerful collection of artifacts in the Marvel Universe was now held by a handful of beings, none of whom held more than one, and the collective arrangement was overseen by a leader who understood the cost of power in a way that made him, by the tribunal's own accounting, unworthy to wield it permanently. There is a particular kind of qualification that looks like disqualification from outside. The Living Tribunal had ruled Adam Warlock unworthy of omnipotence precisely because he understood omnipotence's cost too completely to want it. He had used it correctly because he had used it without desire. And the using without desire was what the tribunal found disqualifying. The ambiguity of someone who has been through enough to be neither good nor evil in the simple sense, who operates from a place beyond those categories, who can be trusted with great power, precisely because the great power doesn't change who they are, and whose unchangeability in the face of great power is also, from a certain angle, a form of incompleteness. The irony is explicit and complete. The quality that made him the only person who could have handled the gauntlet responsibly in that moment was the same quality that made him ineligible to hold it afterward. This is a very specific kind of punishment. And Warlock, who had been living in a version of this specific kind of punishment for his entire existence, too useful for a purpose he had never chosen, too marked by the costs of that usefulness to be eligible for the status the usefulness had earned, received it with the equanimity of someone who has already made their peace with the general principle, if not with this particular application of it. The more you sit with the tribunal's ruling, the stranger and more precise it becomes. It did not say that Warlock had used the gauntlet badly. It did not say that he had abused the power or misapplied it or directed it toward ends that were illegitimate. It said in the careful language of cosmic jurisprudence that the soul from which his decisions were made was no longer intact in the way that cosmic law required for the wielding of absolute power. The expulsion of the Magus, years earlier, had been an expulsion of something essential. and something essential, once expelled, cannot simply be declared present by an act of will or by the quality of subsequent decisions. This is the paradox at the heart of the Tribunal's ruling. The Magus' expulsion was the thing that had made it possible for Warlock to defeat the Magus. He had stepped outside the causal chain that produced his evil future self by choosing to die before the transformation completed, and the choosing had worked, and the Magus had been erased from the timeline. But the mechanism of the erasing had involved a fracturing, a separation within himself that made him more effective in the short term and less complete in the long term. He had paid for the victory over the Magus with the completeness of his soul. The Tribunal was not punishing him for the payment. It was simply noting that the payment had been made, and that the payment's consequences were real. There is a reading of the Tribunal's ruling that casts it as simply cruel, the highest authority in the Marvel cosmos taking the most significant moment of a being's existence and finding it insufficient. This reading is not wrong. There is something genuinely cruel in the ruling's timing, in the fact that the assessment came after the victory rather than before, when nothing Warlock could have done differently would have changed the fundamental condition the Tribunal was identifying. He had not become incomplete through any avoidable choice. The incompleteness was the cost of the choices he had made correctly. The more accurate reading, and the one that Warlock himself seemed to have arrived at in his acceptance of the ruling, is that the Tribunal was not making a judgment about who Adam Warlock was. It was making a judgment about what he was equipped to hold. These are different assessments. You can be worthy as a being, capable, committed, reliable, clear-eyed about what the power requires, and still be constitutionally unsuited to holding permanent omnipotence, because permanent omnipotence requires a completeness that your particular history has made unavailable to you. The two things are compatible. Warlock's acceptance of the ruling suggests that he understood this distinction, and found the ruling, in its specifics, accurate. The Infinity Watch held its arrangement. The cosmos settled, as much as the cosmos ever settles. And in the quiet that followed the largest crisis the Marvel Universe had yet generated, a new threat was already beginning to assemble itself, in the way that new threats always begin in the aftermath of crises too large to leave a stable vacuum behind them. A familiar kind of threat, the most personal kind, the Infinity War of 1992, not the film released 26 years later, which borrowed several of the same narrative elements, but relocated them to a different set of characters, was Jim Starlin's attempt to establish that the defeat of the Magus in the original run had not been the elimination of the Magus, but his displacement. That the evil aspect of Adam Warlock, expelled from him and erased from one specific future, had found a different location in the cosmic architecture and had been quietly building. The Magus of the Infinity War era was not exactly the Magus who had led the Universal Church of Truth across thousands of worlds. He was what remained after the specific future self had been collapsed, something distilled from the core of what the Magus was, rather than the full elaboration of what the Magus had become. The doctrine of the Church was gone. The billions of followers were gone. What remained was something more elemental. The specific orientation toward power that had driven the Magus' construction of his empire. Stripped of the empire, but not of the desire. His plan in this conflict involved cosmic duplicates, perfect copies of Earth's heroes, stripped of their moral complexity and operating from the pure executable versions of their capabilities. The doubles were deployed with a precision that demonstrated the Magus's complete familiarity with the originals. He had access to their memories, their tactical histories, their established methods. He knew, with the specific intimacy of a being who's the dark reflection of someone who had been in contact with all of them, exactly how each hero would respond in a given situation, and what the most effective version of that hero, without the limiting factor of conscience, would do. Adam Warlock faced his own double. This is worth pausing over. He faced a version of himself that had been created from the specific part of his nature that had been expelled in the formation of the Magus, the evil aspect, the capacity for the worst version of his own potential, operating without the counterbalance of everything else he was. He had already faced this once, in the original Magus conflict, when it was still in his future. Now he faced it again, in a different form, and the second facing was different from the first in a specific way. He knew more than he had known the first time. The first time he had faced the Magus, he had been facing a future that was still possible. The weight of that confrontation was the weight of something that could still be prevented. The second time, facing the remnant of what the Magus had been after the prevention, the weight was different. The weight of something that had already happened, that had been partially addressed and not fully resolved, that was returning in a new form to demonstrate that the addressing had been incomplete. Thanos was present in this conflict again. Not from altruism. The framing of Thanos' participation in the Infinity War makes clear that his calculation was, as always, about his own interests intersecting with the situation at hand. But the intersection produced again the particular dynamic that the Magus conflict in the original run had established. Two beings who see the same things coming and who find cooperation more efficient than opposition, without ever losing track of the fact that they have profoundly different orientations toward most of what they cooperate on. The defeat of the Magus in the Infinity War differed from the defeat in the original run in the most important possible way. The first time, Warlock had defeated the Magus by stepping outside the causal chain that would have produced him, by dying at the right moment before the transformation could complete itself. He had won by preventing the future from arriving. This time, the future had already arrived, at least partially, and the Magus was a consequence already in existence rather than a consequence still in the process of being generated. The method had to be different. He dismantled it. Not through the exercise of greater power. The power available to the Magus in his reduced form was substantial, and the assembled resources of the Infinity Watch and the heroes of Earth were required to address the situation. But the decisive element, the specific quality that turned the engagement from a battle to a resolution, was Warlock's understanding of the Magus's construction. He had been the Magus in a potential sense. He knew the architecture of that potential from the inside. And what he knew and what he used was the specific vulnerability of anything built entirely from the worst version of a single quality. It is brittle in exactly the places where the original, carrying all its complexity and ambiguity, is resilient. The Magus was Adam Warlock's evil aspect, refined to its pure expression. That purity was its weakness. It operated without the counterbalancing weight of the grief and the caution and the willingness to pay costs that characterized the full version of Warlock. It was, in the specific sense that the Tribunal had articulated, a simple thing masquerading as a complex one. And Warlock, who was nothing if not complex, and who had spent his entire existence operating from the ambiguity the Tribunal had found disqualifying, dismantled it with the specific quality that the Magus lacked, the ability to hold contradictions without resolving them. The Infinity War ended with the Magus eliminated more thoroughly than he had been the first time, eliminated in a way that addressed the core of what he was, rather than preventing the specific future that had generated him. The elimination cost things. Situations of this scale always cost things. But the Magus, which had been Adam Warlock's evil future self, and then Adam Warlock's expelled evil aspect, and then a distillate of that aspect rebuilt in a new form, was gone. The good aspect had not yet fully manifested, but it was coming. Warlock could feel it in the way that something you have lost a piece of feels its absence, not as pain exactly, but as a gap in the structure of yourself where something used to be. The tribunal had said that both aspects, the evil and the good, had been expelled from him. The Magus had been the first demonstration of what that meant. The goddess would be the second, what the Infinity War also demonstrated, in the specific and uncommented way that good storytelling demonstrates things without announcing them, was the extent to which Thanos had been correct in his separate column accounting of Adam Warlock. In the conflict against the Magus's return, the assembled heroes of Earth and the assembled cosmic forces available to the Infinity Watch were necessary. They were not sufficient. The decisive element, the thing that turned the conflict from an ongoing battle into a resolution, was the specific quality of understanding that Warlock brought to an encounter with his own expelled evil aspect. No other being present could have contributed that specific quality, because no other being present had been the Magus in the potential sense that Warlock had been the Magus. This is the pattern that runs through every major conflict in Warlock's history. The conventional forces do their work, the conventional forces prove insufficient, and the decisive contribution comes from the specific quality that Warlock's specific history has produced, and that no one else's history could have produced. It is not that he is the most powerful being available. He is rarely the most powerful being in any given conflict. It is that he is the most specifically suited being, the one whose particular combination of deaths and returns and costs paid and versions of himself faced has produced a capability precisely calibrated to the threat at hand. Thanos observed this pattern across multiple conflicts. He catalogued it with the specific kind of attention he paid to things he could not fully explain. A being who is consistently the decisive element in conflicts that would otherwise be unresolvable, and who is decisive specifically because of experiences that are uniquely his, is a being whose decisive contribution in future conflicts cannot be reliably predicted, because the future conflicts cannot be fully anticipated, and the specific calibration to them is not available in advance. This is the mechanism of the unpredictability, not randomness, not chaos. The opposite, a being whose responses are perfectly calibrated to situations that cannot be anticipated because the calibration itself cannot be anticipated. And between the second demonstration and the first, in the space that a cosmos in recovery generates, something like quiet settled for a while on the situation. Not peace, because the situations involving Adam Warlock rarely produce anything that accurately deserves to be called peace. But a pause, a breath between one chapter of the cost and the next. The Infinity Crusade of 1993 completed the arc that the Infinity War had begun, and it completed it in the most uncomfortable possible direction. If the Magus had been the proof that Adam Warlock's evil aspect, expelled and operating alone, produced something catastrophic, the goddess was the proof that his good aspect, expelled and operating alone, produced something equally catastrophic by a different mechanism. She appeared as the leader of a movement of cosmic purification, a force of absolute good, in the specific way that absolute good is actually a very dangerous thing, without nuance, without the willingness to hold the complexity of lived experience, without the understanding that the good that requires the elimination of everything that is not purely good is not, on balance, good at all. She had assembled a collection of heroes whose faith-based orientation, heroes with religious or spiritual grounding, heroes whose moral framework had a devotional quality, made them susceptible to her influence, not through manipulation in the conventional sense, but through the genuine resonance between what she offered and something real in who they were. Her plan involved the cosmic containment units, devices capable of channeling and focusing energy on a cosmic scale, and the use of those devices to cleanse the universe of what she regarded as impurity. The plan was, by the standards of its stated intentions, an expression of the purest possible good. It was also a plan for the systematic destruction of everything that did not meet a standard of purity that nothing in the actual universe could consistently meet. The good that was not complicated enough to live alongside the impure was a good that would eliminate more than it saved. Adam Warlock, facing the goddess, was facing the best part of himself. This is the fact that the Infinity Crusade handles with the most precision and the most discomfort. Not a villain, not an evil aspect shaped by the worst of what he was. His own expelled goodness, his own highest aspirations for what the universe could be, operating as an antagonist because operating alone, without the complicating weight of the ambiguous middle that the tribunal had found disqualifying, it had become dangerous. He had to oppose it. He had to be the ambiguous middle against the purity. He had to be the argument that imperfection is necessary, that the thing which is only good in the absence of everything impure is not good in any sense that the actually existing universe can use. He had to make this argument against a version of himself whose position was, from a purely abstract perspective, not without logic, and he had to make it while understanding that the version of himself, making the opposite case, was arguing from something he had genuinely lost when it was expelled. The Infinity Watch assembled. The heroes who had not been brought under the goddess's influence assembled with them. The conflict operated on multiple levels simultaneously, which is consistent with how conflicts involving Adam Warlock tend to operate. The physical level, the cosmic power level, and underneath both of those, the level of the argument about what goodness actually means when it has to operate in a universe that contains things other than itself. The defeat of the goddess was accomplished. The cosmic containment units were addressed. The heroes who had been drawn under her influence were freed. The specifics of how this was accomplished, the combination of power and strategy, and the particular quality of Warlock's engagement with a version of himself he could not simply overpower, are documented in the issues of the Infinity Crusade Limited series, across 13 issues published across 1993. What the specifics add up to, reduced to their essential form, is this. Warlock defeated the best version of himself by being the complicated version of himself, and the complicated version won because the universe they both existed in was complicated, and purity without complexity has no purchase on complicated things. In the aftermath, he understood something about himself, with a clarity that the full sequence of events, the Magus, the tribunal's ruling, the goddess, had assembled one piece at a time across several years. He had lost his evil aspect. He had lost his good aspect. What remained, the ambiguous middle that the tribunal had found insufficient, was not a reduced version of what he had been to. It was a different thing. A being who had faced the worst possible version of himself and not become it. Who had faced the best possible version of himself and found it wanting. Who was neither the monster nor the saint, and who operated in the space between those categories with the specific quality of something that cannot be captured by either extreme. The Living Tribunal had called this disqualifying. The Tribunal was not wrong by the standards it applied, but the standard the Tribunal applied was the standard of cosmic authority. The standard that asks whether a being can be trusted with absolute power. By that standard, the ambiguous middle was correctly identified as insufficient. By a different standard, the standard of what is actually useful in a universe that contains beings like the Magus and the goddess and Thanos simultaneously, the ambiguous middle was the only thing that could navigate all three. He had defeated his evil self by choosing to die rather than become it. He had defeated his good self by remaining complicated enough to resist it. He had held the Infinity Gauntlet long enough to restore what had been destroyed, and then released it when the judgment came. What he was by this point in his history was not heroic in the conventional sense. It was something harder to name and harder to oppose. He was a being who had survived every version of himself. The aftermath of the Infinity Crusade settled the cosmic landscape in a way that the aftermath of the Infinity War had not. The Infinity War had closed one chapter of the question about Warlock's nature, the chapter concerning his evil aspect, while leaving the second chapter open. The Crusade closed the second chapter. What remained after both chapters were closed was the specific and irreducible core of what Adam Warlock was, the ambiguous middle that the Tribunal had found disqualifying, and that the cosmos kept finding essential. The quality of that middle is worth trying to specify, even if the specification is necessarily incomplete. It was not the absence of conviction. Warlock had conviction in the specific sense of a being who has made the hardest choices available and held to them from full knowledge. It was not the absence of moral grounding. His resistance to the goddess demonstrated that he had a moral framework precise enough to identify the problem with purity that cannot coexist with complexity. It was the absence of simplicity. He could not be reduced to a single value, a single quality, a single organizing principle. The Magus had been reducible, all cruelty and power in the end. The goddess had been reducible, all purity and the refusal of impurity in the end. Warlock was not reducible. He was the sum of everything he had been through, held in tension, and that sum was complicated in a way that resisted any single framing. Thanos, who had watched both the Infinity War and the Infinity Crusade from his various positions of strategic observation, updated his assessment of Warlock after both events. The update was not a change of conclusion. The conclusion had been established during the Magus conflict in the original run. It was a deepening of confidence in the conclusion. He had identified Warlock as unpredictable because Warlock operated from a decision-making framework that no existing model could replicate. The Infinity War and the Infinity Crusade had provided additional evidence. Warlock had faced the most personal possible enemies, his own worst self and his own best self, and had not become either of them. A being who can do that has demonstrated, beyond any further need for demonstration, that their essential nature is genuinely stable against the strongest possible pressures. Which is another way of saying, their next move in any given situation will be determined by who they actually are, and who they actually are cannot be predicted by anyone who is not them. This looked, to the people watching from outside, like the end of the major crises of Adam Warlock's life. The Magus was gone. The goddess was gone. The Infinity Gauntlet question had been answered. The Infinity Watch held its arrangement. Things were, by any available measure, resolved. It was a false peak, the kind that only becomes visible as such from further along the story. But from where everyone stood at the time, it felt like a rival. Like the long sequence of costs had finally balanced the ledger. Like the work was done. Years passed. In the Marvel publishing timeline, the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s were not the primary era for cosmic stories. The attention of the Marvel Universe shifted to the events of Earth, to the human-scale stories that comics returned to between their larger cosmological expansions, to the ordinary extraordinary business of heroes and villains and the cities and streets that contain them. The Infinity Watch operated in a lower profile. Adam Warlock appeared in various contexts, maintaining the specific quality he had maintained throughout, present, capable, marked by everything he had been through, and not particularly interested in the kinds of celebrity that other cosmic-level figures cultivated. When the cosmic era of Marvel Comics resumed in earnest, in the stories published from 2006 onward, in the event called Annihilation and its sequel, Annihilation: Conquest, it resumed with the specific energy of a narrative that has been held at low pressure for a long time and is now releasing. Annihilation was the invasion of the positive universe by the forces of the negative zone, led by Annihilus and his annihilation wave. An army of cosmic scale and destructive intent, sweeping through the inhabited universe in the manner of something that has been held behind a boundary for too long and has finally found a way through. The casualty scale of the annihilation wave is difficult to convey in the terms usually available for cosmic scale events in Marvel Comics, because even the terms available for cosmic scale Marvel events were insufficient to fully render the wave's scope. Nova Corps members measured in thousands fell in the opening stages. Planets were consumed. The assembled cosmic defenders, the heralds of Galactus, the Nova Corps, the Kree and Skrull empires in uneasy alliance against a common threat, were pushed back through territory they were not accustomed to giving up. Warlock's role in the Annihilation conflict was not that of its central figure. The Annihilation event belongs, in its primary narrative, to Richard Rider's Nova and to Drax the Destroyer, and to the particular coalition they assembled against Annihilus. But Warlock's contribution to that coalition was consistent with the specific quality he had always brought to crisis situations. Not the strongest fighter, not the most obvious hero, but the being whose judgment of the situation was built on a depth of experience that no one else in the assembled resistance could match. He had died multiple times. He had been absorbed by his own artifact and spent years in amber light. He had faced his own evil future self and his own expelled goodness as antagonists. He had held omnipotence and released it when asked. He had survived every version of himself. What this accumulation of experience produced, in the context of the Annihilation conflict, was a quality of steadiness in the face of loss that the other members of the resistance found difficult to replicate and impossible to fully explain. He was not unaffected by the scale of the wave's destruction. He was simply not destabilized by it in the way that beings without his particular history would have been destabilized. The sequel event Annihilation Conquest, published in 2007 and 2008, involved the Phalanx, a techno-organic species with assimilation capabilities that operated through infection rather than invasion. The Phalanx had moved into the Kree Empire in the wake of Annihilation's damage, and had begun the process of transforming it, converting organic beings into something that was neither organic nor fully synthetic, something that obeyed the Phalanx Collective, in the way of something that has lost the individual architecture of itself. Adam Warlock was captured. He was infected. He became, briefly, a member of the Phalanx Select, the highest order of those who had been converted, who retained a greater degree of the original self, but who operated within the Phalanx's organizational logic rather than their own. This is worth noting. He had spent his entire existence resisting the attempts of external forces to define what he was. The Enclave had tried to define him as a weapon. The High Evolutionary had tried to define him as a protector. The Magus had shown him what he could become if allowed to run to his own worst conclusion. And the Phalanx, operating by the specific mechanism of infection rather than persuasion, had briefly succeeded where all of those had failed. Briefly. The resistance, in the form of Quasar and the assembled forces fighting the Phalanx infection, created the conditions for Warlock's emergence from the Select. The emergence was not a clean reversal. It was, like most of the returns in his history, a coming back that was different from the going in. He emerged from the Phalanx infection carrying a different understanding of what it meant to be subsumed, to have the individual architecture of yourself replaced by something that doesn't care about the individual architecture of yourself, and a different appreciation for the specific quality that had made him unsuitable for the Phalanx to fully retain, the ambiguous middle that resisted the binary logic of assimilation. The Phalanx operated on binary principles, with us or against us, converted or destroyed, Phalanx or not Phalanx. The ambiguous middle that the Living Tribunal had found disqualifying was, by the same token, the thing that made complete Phalanx conversion impossible. You cannot assimilate what will not resolve into simple categories. In the aftermath of the Annihilation Conquest event, a group of individuals who had been involved in the fighting, who had found each other in the specific way that people find each other in the aftermath of shared catastrophes, began organizing in a way that would eventually produce one of the more enduring configurations in the cosmic Marvel landscape. The Guardians of the Galaxy, in the form that Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning would develop across the series, beginning in 2008, were not yet fully formed. But the architecture of them was present in the aftermath of Conquest, and Adam Warlock was part of that architecture. What distinguished Warlock's contribution to the Annihilation conflict from the contributions of the other assembled defenders was not capability. The assembled defenders were capable, many of them extraordinarily so, and the conflict required that capability at every level. What distinguished his contribution was the quality of his relationship with loss. The annihilation wave destroyed at a scale that produces a specific kind of despair in beings who have not previously experienced loss at that scale. The despair that comes from the recognition that the losses are too large for any available framework of response to contain. Planets gone. Populations erased. The architectural fabric of the inhabited cosmos rearranged by an enemy that moved faster than any response could follow. He had experienced loss at scales that most beings cannot survive experiencing without a significant change to their fundamental orientation. Counter-Earth had been a loss of that scale. The amber years in the Soul Gem had been in their own way a loss of that scale, the loss of participation in the ongoing world, the absence from everything that continued without him. The Tribunal's ruling had been a loss of a different kind, but not a lesser one. What these losses had produced, across the accumulation of them, was not the despair that the annihilation wave was inflicting on the beings who had not previously lost at this scale. It was something that looked from outside like a form of steadiness that shouldn't be available in the circumstances. It was not the steadiness of someone who didn't care about the losses. He cared. The losses registered in him the same way they registered in the others. What was different was that he had been to the other side of loss at this scale, and had come back, and the coming back had produced a knowledge, not comfort, not optimism, not the false resolution of telling himself it would be all right, but a knowledge that loss at any scale is navigable if you remain yourself while navigating it. That the loss does not have to take the self with it. That you can lose everything and still be the specific being who is making the next decision. And that the next decision made from the same place as all your previous decisions is the only coherent response available. The Annihilation Crisis produced a generation of cosmic heroes who had been forged in the specific way that impossible loss forges people. Faster, more focused, less attached to outcomes that couldn't be guaranteed. Warlock's role in that generation was not to lead it, but to exist within it as proof that what they were becoming was survivable, not just in the sense that they wouldn't die from it, but in the sense that who they were could survive it intact. He was the evidence, walking through the middle of the worst of it, that the integrity of the self is not conditional on the scale of the losses. This is not a small thing to provide. It is in fact one of the more important things that any being can provide to any other being in circumstances of that kind. He did not seek leadership of the group. He did not position himself as the most senior or the most capable. He occupied the specific place that his qualities made most natural. The advisor, the perspective, the being in the room who had died more times than anyone else, and returned more changed each time. The Guardians, Quill, Drax, Gamora, Rocket, Groot, and the others who would cycle through the roster were not the kind of team that benefits from a single authority. They benefited from the specific quality that Warlock provided. Someone who had been to the outside of enough situations to see the inside of them with less distortion than beings who had never been outside. The Guardians of the Galaxy series that Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning published beginning in 2008 is, for many readers of the current era, the primary introduction to Adam Warlock, the version that shaped the characters who would eventually appear in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and who gave Warlock's presence in that franchise its particular quality. It is a good introduction. But it is not, for reasons that the history makes clear, the full picture. Warlock in the Abnett-Lanning Guardians occupied a role that was different from any role he had occupied in previous configurations. He was the team's oldest member, in terms of what he had experienced and what those experiences had cost him, but he did not hold the role of patriarch or commander. He held something more like the role of memory, the person in the group who had been through enough versions of the worst possible situations to know that the worst possible situations can be survived, and that what comes after them is different from what came before, and that different is not the same as better, but it is also not the same as failure. The specific conflicts the Abnett-Lanning Guardians addressed, including the War of Kings, the conflict between the Inhumans under Black Bolt and the Shi'ar under Vulcan that threatened to tear the fabric of the universe, and the fault that the War of Kings created in the structure of space-time, were conflicts of cosmic scale that required exactly the kind of perspective Warlock had developed across decades of dying and returning and being through things that people without his history could not have been through. He died again during this period, The specifics of the death are detailed in the War of Kings crossover materials. A death in the context of the fault, in the space where reality's structure had been compromised, which meant a death in circumstances that made the usual mechanics of death and return less predictable than they had been in previous cycles. He returned as he always returned. He returned different as he always returned different. The particular texture of what was different this time is not easy to specify in terms that don't require a working knowledge of what the fault was and how it interacted with the mechanics of resurrection in the context of the Soul Gem's capabilities. What can be said more simply is this: each death and return left him more precisely calibrated to the specific shape of his own limits and the specific depth of his own resources. The deaths were not accumulating as damage. They were accumulating as knowledge. The pattern across 50 years of publication, the pattern of emergence, confrontation, defeat, cocoon, return, more knowing, had been consistent from the first moment in the beehive. The form changed with each iteration. The cocoon in the first instance, the absorption into the soul gem, the amber interior, the various circumstances of various deaths. The form was always different. The result was always the same kind of result. A being who came back carrying more of himself than he had carried before. Who arrived more certainly at the truth of what he was. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Adam Warlock first appeared not as a character, but as a promise. In the post-credits scene of Thor: The Dark World, released in 2013, a golden cocoon was visible among the collector's artifacts, recognized immediately by readers of the comics as the specific image associated with Warlock's arrival and departure and arrival again. The MCU was making the announcement that the cocoon was there, and that what was inside it was relevant, without yet being ready to open it. He opened in Guardians of the Galaxy Vol. 3, released in 2023, played by Will Poulter with a physicality and a quality of sincere bewilderment that was, in its own way, faithful to the essential question at the center of every version of Adam Warlock. A being who has been given a purpose he did not choose, who has been told what he is before he has had the chance to discover what he is, and who must navigate the gap between the definition he was handed and the being he actually turns out to be. The MCU version is younger, less marked by the accumulating weight of decades of death and return, beginning at the beginning rather than somewhere in the middle of the long story. But the beginning is the same beginning. The question is the same question. What does a being created as a weapon become when it refuses the weapon's purpose? This is the question Adam Warlock has been answering, across every continuity and every iteration and every death and every return, since the moment he emerged from the golden cocoon in the Florida Everglades and moved through the wall of the beehive without breaking stride. The specific contribution Warlock made to the Abnet Lanning Guardians and to the larger cosmic narrative of the post-annihilation era was the contribution of historical depth. Every other member of the Guardians had their particular history, their particular costs paid, and relationships formed and loyalties tested. But Warlock's history was different in kind as well as in scale. He had been operating at the cosmic level since before most of his teammates had been born. He had faced the specific threats, the Universal Church of Truth, Thanos, the Infinity Gems, the question of what happened when absolute power was held and then relinquished, that the current era of cosmic marvel was generating in new configurations. He had notes. This is not a metaphor. The Warlock who joined the Guardians carried, inside the specific texture of who he was, a working knowledge of every major cosmic threat that the Marvel Universe had generated since the mid-1970s. Not as data points that could be extracted and used directly. The threats arrived in new forms each time, and direct application of previous experience to new situations is a form of intellectual laziness that the new situations punish, but as structural knowledge, as the understanding of how these kinds of threats are built and what they actually want and where the leverage is. This is the kind of knowledge that cannot be learned from records, cannot be acquired through study of documents. It can only be acquired by being present, across the long accumulation of actual encounters, and by surviving those encounters in a way that preserves the understanding rather than simply producing the trauma. In the years following the Abnett Lanning Guardians era, in the various configurations that the cosmic Marvel landscape has passed through in the time since, Adam Warlock has remained a presence. Not always in the foreground, not always in the primary narrative focus, but present in the way of something that the cosmos periodically requires, and periodically generates the conditions to deploy. The pattern has not changed. The golden cocoon forms, in whatever metaphorical or literal sense the current circumstances require, and inside it something is becoming. And when the becoming is complete, the being who emerges will be more himself than the one who went in. And the cosmos, which keeps generating things that require specifically him, will find him ready in the specific way he has always been ready. Not through preparation in the conventional sense, but through having been, reliably and consistently, himself. The answer, assembled across 50-plus years of publication, is not simple. It is not the answer of a weapon that became a hero in the conventional sense. It is not the answer of a tool that found a better purpose. It is something more complicated and more interesting. A being who kept refusing every definition offered to him. Weapon, protector, saint, monster, chosen one, unworthy. And who kept returning. From death and from amber, and from the phalanx, and from every other thing that tried to make him into something fixed, as a more complete version of the thing he was choosing to be. Not perfect, not finished, not resolved, but his. Return now to the question that the story began with. 6 stones, 1 gauntlet, half of all life in the universe removed between one breath and the next, and one name sitting in a different column of Thanos' planning than all the others. Not higher, not more powerful, just different, requiring a different kind of accounting. The kind of accounting you apply to a variable you have correctly identified as unpredictable, and have been unable to make predictable no matter how long you study it. The documentation of Thanos' regard for Adam Warlock is scattered across multiple Starlin runs, across supplementary material, across the specific texture of how their exchanges are written in the pages of the Infinity Gauntlet and its predecessor stories. It is not stated flatly in any single place, because Thanos is not a being who states his fears flatly. He acknowledges them through the quality of his attention, through the specific way he returns, in his planning, to the same name, through the distinction, visible in the pages to careful readers, between the beings he prepares against and the being he studies. He prepared against Thor. He prepared against the Silver Surfer, against the assembled might of the cosmic entities, against the living embodiments of the universe's oldest powers. The preparation was thorough and, as the Infinity Gauntlet demonstrated, fully adequate to the situations those beings presented. He had modelled them correctly. He had anticipated what they would do, and where they would be, and what the upper limits of their effectiveness against him were. The battle in Infinity Gauntlet issues 4 and 5 is, in a precise sense, the demonstration that Thanos' preparation had been correct. The beings he prepared against were defeated in the order and by the methods his preparation had anticipated. Against Warlock, he did not prepare. He studied. This distinction is visible in the specific quality of the attention he paid. The way Warlock appears in Starlin's stories, not as a tactical problem to be solved, but as a question to be kept close, to be watched, to be held in the active part of the mind, rather than placed in the resolved and filed part. He had identified the variable as unpredictable. He was too rigorous to pretend that identifying something as unpredictable is the same as accounting for it. He could not account for it. He kept studying it anyway in the hope that enough study would eventually produce the accountability that eluded him. What Warlock had that produced this specific quality of unaccountability was not, at its root, power. It was experience of a kind that produced a relationship with decision-making that no other being in Thanos' model had developed. He had made the Magus decision, choosing to die rather than become the worst version of himself, with no guarantee of return and no external compulsion to make the choice. He had made the Soul Gem decision, wearing a soul-eating artifact by conscious choice from full knowledge of what it was eating every day because the accounting said the alternative was worse. He had made the Gauntlet decision, using omnipotence to restore rather than to hold, releasing it when the judgment came, accepting the ruling without argument. Each of these decisions shares a single quality. They were made from inside full knowledge, in the absence of any preferable alternative, without the softening of self-deception. They were hard decisions, correctly identified as hard, made without the relief of pretending they were anything else. A being who makes decisions this way is not predictable by normal modeling, because normal modeling is built on the assumption that beings will prefer the easier version of things, will gravitate toward the option that asks less of them, will flinch at the full weight of a cost when a partial payment is available. Warlock did not flinch. He had not, in any encounter documented in the pages of his history, chosen the partial payment when the situation called for the full one. This is what Thanos, who spent his existence making calculations, recognized as genuinely uncategorizable. Not admirable, necessarily. Thanos' sense of admiration was complex and not organized around the same priorities as most beings' admiration, but genuinely uncategorizable. He had a taxonomy of beings. It was comprehensive. He had placed every significant figure in the cosmos into some category within it, and the placement had always been accurate enough to be useful. Adam Warlock did not fit the taxonomy cleanly. He was too willing to pay full costs. He was too clear-eyed about what those costs were. He was too consistently himself across too wide a range of circumstances for the normal modeling tools to generate confident predictions about him. In the specific moments within the Infinity Gauntlet pages, where Thanos and Warlock are in proximity, where their awareness of each other is made visible through the quality of attention each pays to the other, the pages carry a tone that the rest of the Gauntlet story does not have. It is not the tone of opponent and opponent. It is the tone of two beings who see each other accurately, with the specific kind of discomfort that accurate mutual recognition produces between beings who are not, in any simple sense, friends. Fear, for a being like Thanos, does not wear the face of conventional fear. It does not produce avoidance. It produces study. It produces the specific kind of attention that is actually a form of respect. In the vocabulary of someone whose respect is not freely given, and whose attention is not frequently caught. Thanos studied Adam Warlock across the long years of their opposition and collaboration, because Warlock was the only being in his extended experience whose next move he could not predict with the confidence his study of other beings had produced. And in the vocabulary of comprehensive preparation, the thing you cannot predict is the thing you are afraid of. This is the center of the story. Not the battles, not the deaths and returns, not the gauntlet or the tribunal's ruling, or the Magus or the goddess. All of those were the content of the story. The center of it, the thing the story is actually about, is this. A being was created as a weapon, dismissed as a failed experiment, and spent his entire existence refusing every definition offered to him. And in the refusing, across every death and return, and amber year and terrible choice made from full knowledge, he became the one thing in the cosmos that the being who held omnipotence couldn't fully account for. The weapon the Enclave built was supposed to be predictable. Weapons are built to be predictable. This is what makes them useful. Adam Warlock's refusal to be a weapon was, paradoxically, what made him more dangerous than any weapon the Enclave could have successfully built. Because a predictable weapon can always be countered by someone who studies it. An unpredictable being. A being whose decisions are made from a database of experience that no one else shares, who keeps returning more himself from every encounter with the worst possible circumstances. That being cannot be countered by study alone. You can only account for them by being present, by watching, by keeping the variable active in the foremost part of your attention, and hoping that when the moment comes, the moment is one you can navigate. Thanos could navigate almost everything. He had built his existence on the bedrock of that capability. He had made himself into the most comprehensively prepared being in the cosmos, and the preparation had served him across decades of acquisition and conflict, and the long, patient assembly of everything he needed for the gesture that removed half of all life. Against that bedrock, Adam Warlock was not an immovable object. He was something more disquieting. A moving object whose direction of movement could not be reliably predicted. A variable that kept generating new data points that didn't fit the existing model, requiring the model to be revised, producing a new model that the next data point would again not fit. This is, in the technical vocabulary of Thanos' form of planning, the definition of something to be feared, not because it can kill you. Many things can potentially kill Thanos, and he has prepared for most of them, but because it means the preparation is always incomplete. Because it means the variable is always active. Because it means that in the moment when everything else has been accounted for, and the plan is executing exactly as designed, there is still this one name in its separate column, and you still do not know what it will do. The specific arc of Thanos' relationship with fear, and with the specific quality of regard he extended to Adam Warlock, is documented not in any single statement, but in the cumulative texture of how Starlin writes the interactions between them across all the runs. It is present in the way Thanos speaks of Warlock when Warlock is not present. With the specific gravity that Thanos reserves for problems he has not solved, it is present in the way the planning unfolds in the Gauntlet era, where Thanos' accounting for every other significant figure in the assembled opposition is confident and final, and his accounting for Warlock returns again and again, in different forms, each time finding the same gap that the previous analysis had found. The gap was not a gap in information. Thanos had more information about Adam Warlock than about most beings, more documented encounters, more observed behavior across more varied circumstances, more examples of the decision-making patterns that the modeling was supposed to be capturing. The gap was not informational, it was structural. The modeling framework Thanos applied to beings was built on the assumption that beings could be modeled, that with sufficient information and sufficient analytical capability, the behavior of a being in any given situation could be predicted to a useful degree of confidence. Adam Warlock generated sufficient data points to run the model, and kept generating outcomes the model had not predicted. This meant the model was wrong. Not wrong about Warlock's capabilities. Wrong about the framework that would allow those capabilities to be predicted. The framework was wrong because it was built on the assumption that beings' decisions are ultimately determined by a stable and mappable set of motivations: self-preservation, power-seeking, loyalty to allies, adherence to values, and the various combinations and hierarchies of these that distinguish one being from another. This framework works for virtually every being Thanos had ever modeled. It does not work for a being whose decisions are made from a place that is genuinely past those motivating forces, who has already died multiple times and found it navigable, who has already held and released omnipotence, who has already defeated his own worst self and his own best self, and arrived on the other side of both, at something that the motivating forces of ordinary existence do not move in the directions they move ordinary beings. The only man Thanos was ever afraid of did not earn that fear by being stronger. He earned it by being across every possible version of himself, consistently, unmistakably, irreducibly himself. A golden being in a golden cocoon, drifting between the stars, becoming the next thing he needed to be. Again and again and again, as many times as the cosmos required it. Somewhere in the amber interior of the soul gem, in the warm and timeless light of the dimension that exists inside its facets, the souls the gem has consumed over the years continue their quiet and unending afternoon. They move through it the way time moves in the deep parts of the ocean. Without reference to a surface, without the organizing pressure of urgency, in the specific quality of permanence that belongs to things that have been held for a very long time, in a very still place. Adam Warlock has been inside that space and outside it and inside it again. He has worn the gem and been consumed by it and returned to wearing it. He has carried it on his forehead across decades of publication and across multiple deaths, and across the amber years of the timeless interior, and across every version of himself that the cosmos has asked him to be, and that he has refused. The gem knows him in the way of something that has held a person from the inside. The person knows the gem in the way of something that has been inside what it wears. This is the relationship at the center of Adam Warlock's story. Not the relationship with Thanos, though that relationship is the frame of the most recent telling. Not the relationship with Counter-Earth, or the High Evolutionary, or the Magus, or the Goddess. The relationship with the Soul Gem. The artifact he was given without being told what it was, whose cost he discovered slowly and paid completely, which consumed him and released him, and which he kept returning to. Not from obligation, but from the same quality of clear-eyed choosing that characterized every other decision he ever made. He chose the gem because the accounting said the gem was necessary. He kept choosing it as the accounting changed, and the costs accumulated, and the amber interior became familiar in the way of a place you have been against your will and then returned to willingly, which is different from never having been there at all. He wore it as the years passed, and the battles were fought and the worst versions of himself were faced. And the omnipotence was briefly held and released, and the tribunal's ruling was accepted, and the Magus was dismantled, and the goddess was opposed, and the phalanx was resisted, and the Guardians were joined, and the deaths kept coming, and the returns kept arriving. The story of Adam Warlock is the story of a being who was told what he was before he had the chance to discover it. The Enclave told him. The High Evolutionary told him. The Magus showed him. The Tribunal ruled on him. The Phalanx tried to define him by assimilation. Each definition was offered with the confidence of whoever was offering it, and none of them held, because the being they were offered to kept choosing, from inside full knowledge of every available option, to be something the definitions didn't contain. This is the thesis compressed to its shortest form. He was built to be a weapon. He became the one thing that couldn't be weaponized. Not because he was incapable of violence, not because he lacked the power, but because every attempt to make him into an instrument of the Enclave's vision, of the High Evolutionary's mission, of the Magus's destiny, of the Tribunal's categories, of the Gauntlet's omnipotence, encountered the same quality, expressed differently but consistently. The quiet, clear-eyed refusal of a being who has already done his own accounting and arrived at his own answer. Thanos, who spent decades studying that quality and never fully accounting for it, recognized something in it that his taxonomy could not contain. He recognized it as the thing that makes a being genuinely dangerous. Not power, not ambition, not even intelligence, but the specific combination of full self-knowledge and the willingness to act from that knowledge without flinching. You can plan around everything except someone who has already planned around themselves. In the stories that come after this one, in the future of the cosmic Marvel landscape, which continues to generate new crises and new configurations and new occasions for the beings at its center to demonstrate or fail to demonstrate who they are. Adam Warlock will likely die again. He will likely return from that death more precisely himself. The pattern is consistent enough, across 50-plus years of publication, to be treated less as a plot device and more as a statement about the kind of being he is. One whose essential quality is not located in continuous living, but in the specific and reliable quality of what he brings back from wherever he goes when the living stops. The golden cocoon is not a wound. It was never a wound. It was always the form that his particular kind of becoming takes. The interval between one version of himself and the next, the warm and patient darkness in which the next thing he needs to be is slowly becoming itself. The being who emerges will be him. He will be more him than the one who went in. And whatever the cosmos has assembled in the interim, whatever crisis or question or confrontation requires exactly the quality that this specific pattern of dying and returning and becoming has produced, will have its variable. It's one moving thing whose direction could not be reliably predicted. Its reason for a different column on the list. The universe does not generate beings like Adam Warlock by intention. It generates them by accumulation, by the specific process of placing a being in situation after situation that is larger than any previous situation, each one requiring something the previous ones had not required, each one paid for and survived and learned from, in a way that changes the fundamental texture of the being doing the surviving. The beehive was the first situation. Counter-Earth was the second. The Soul Gem's hunger was the third. The Magus was the fourth. The Infinity Gauntlet and the Tribunal, and the Goddess and the Phalanx, and the Annihilation Wave were the fifth and sixth and seventh and eighth and ninth and 10th. The accumulation is the process. The process takes as long as it takes. The specific quality that all of this accumulation produced, the quality that Thanos found unpredictable, that the Tribunal found disqualifying, that the Enclave never anticipated and the High Evolutionary never fully understood is not a quality that has a clean name. It is something like the combination of complete self-knowledge and unconditional self-continuity. The state of a being who knows exactly what they are, including the worst of it, including the cost of it, including the specific ways in which they are insufficient by every available standard of measurement, and who continues to be that thing anyway, without revision, without the comfortable softening of self-deception, because the accounting that they have done from inside that full knowledge has produced again and again the conclusion that this is still the right answer. Sleep now, if you haven't yet. The stars outside are very far apart, and the distance between them is very dark, and the darkness is very quiet in the specific way of something that has been quiet for a very long time, and has made a kind of peace with the quietness. Somewhere in that dark, the golden light of the soul gem is a warm and barely visible thing, smaller than a star from any distance, warmer than the dark that surrounds it. Inside it, the perpetual afternoon continues. The souls move through their amber light, and the being who has been inside it and outside it and inside it again floats on in his cocoon, becoming the next version of himself, unhurried, thorough, taking the time that this kind of becoming requires. The only man Thanos was ever afraid of. Becoming, even now, almost ready, almost here. Close your eyes if you haven't yet. The stars are very far apart, and the space between them is very quiet, and somewhere in that quiet a golden shape is drifting on currents too slow for any instrument to map. Inside it, something is becoming. The amber light of the soul gem falls softly on the souls it keeps, and they move through their perpetual afternoon without urgency, without the pressure of anything that needs to be resolved. And out here, in the space between the stars, the universe continues its patient business, assembling the next thing that will require the one variable it cannot fully account for. The one who keeps coming back. The only man Thanos was ever afraid of. Drifting, becoming, almost ready, almost here.